Journal entry, date unknown. I'm not sure why I'm writing this down. Maybe it's my way of coping, or maybe it's because I still have hope. Some desperate shred that tells me this could serve as a record for someone, someday. But why does that even matter? No one will find this. No one can help us. Still, I find some strange comfort in putting the events on paper, so as long as I am able, I will continue. I wasn't always like this, writing in a panic. Helen and I didn't immediately realize the situation we were in. At first, we tried to brush it off, rationalize it. God, we tried to make sense of it. But slowly, surely, we were forced to accept that this wasn't normal. Nothing about this place, this situation, this parking lot is normal. We were just your average family. We were happy in our late 20s, excited to attend a football game with our 3-year-old son, Bud. That's all it was supposed to be. A simple outing. Just a fun night out. We weren't even that invested in the game. Bud had gotten restless, and since neither of us really cared for the teams playing, we decided to leave a little early. It seemed like a smart choice at the time. Avoid the traffic, get home sooner, tuck Bud into bed. I wish we had stayed until the end of the game. Maybe then we wouldn't be here. Maybe then none of this would have happened. It was Friday, September the 8th, 2023. I remember the day well, every detail etched in my mind now, crystal clear in ways that mundane days usually aren't. The sun was setting as we left the stadium, casting long shadows across the asphalt. The sky was that perfect blend of orange and pink, the way it gets just before night falls completely. And then, the first strange thing happened. The parking lot was full, absolutely packed, rows upon rows of cars, just as it had been when we arrived earlier. But the people, where were all the people? We should have seen dozens of others heading to their cars, chatting, laughing, honking horns as they tried to leave, but there wasn't a soul in sight, just us. Helen noticed it first. She stopped walking, her eyes scanning the horizon. "Where is everyone?" she asked, her voice a mix of confusion and worry. I remember shrugging it off at first, thinking maybe they had already left, or maybe there was another exit we weren't seeing. But the longer we walked, the more unsettling it became. The silence was eerie, unnatural even. We were surrounded by thousands of cars, yet there wasn't a sound. No engines revving, no doors slamming, no voices. Just us, walking through the endless rows of parked cars. The unease crept up slowly, like a cold chill down my spine. I told myself it was nothing, just a weird coincidence, but then the parking lot itself started to change. At first it was subtle, almost imperceptible. Helen was the one who noticed it. Of course, she always had a better eye for details than I did. "I don't remember the lot being this steep," she said, frowning as she looked around. I stopped and turned to see what she was talking about. She was right. The ground wasn't flat anymore, it was sloping, rising and falling in gentle waves, like the surface of a giant ocean made of asphalt and metal. It didn't make sense. This was a parking lot, a flat, even expanse where we had parked countless times before, but now it was like the land itself was shifting beneath our feet. "Did we go out the wrong door?" Helen asked, her voice laced with growing worry. I didn't know what to say. I didn't have an answer. It didn't seem possible, but the landscape around us was changing. We had been walking for what felt like hours, and yet we hadn't found our car. The cars around us seemed to stretch on forever, an endless sea of metal that grew more disorienting the longer we walked. By the time the sun disappeared completely behind the horizon, I felt a knot of fear tighten in my chest. The parking lot was supposed to be lit by streetlights, illuminated by the glow of the nearby stadium, but as the darkness descended, I realized there were no lights. Not in the lot, not on the horizon, not from the stadium. Just darkness, complete and utter darkness. Bud whimpered in Helen's arms, sensing our fear. Helen shifted him to her other hip and tried to comfort him, but I could see the fear in her eyes too. She was trying to stay calm, trying to keep it together for Bud's sake, but the longer we walked, the more it became clear that something was horribly, terribly wrong. We walked for what felt like hours, our footsteps echoing in the unnatural silence. Every now and then, I would pull out my phone, hoping to get a signal, but there was nothing. No service, no bars. Our phones were useless. I don't remember when we stopped walking that night, but I know it wasn't until after midnight. We had been walking aimlessly through the lot, our legs aching and our bodies exhausted. Bud had fallen asleep in Helen's arms, his little head resting on her shoulder. I was carrying the diaper bag, though at that point we hadn't needed it. Bud had been so good, so quiet, as if he instinctively knew not to cry or complain. I remember the conversation Helen and I had that night. It was the first of many arguments, though we didn't know it at the time. I wanted to keep moving, to keep searching for our car, convinced that if we just kept going, we would find it. Helen, on the other hand, thought we should stay put. If we keep moving, we'll just get more lost, she said, her voice trembling. We need to stay in one spot. That way someone can find us. Looking back, I don't know who was right. Maybe neither of us. Maybe this place, this endless lot, was never going to let us leave, no matter what we did. But in that moment, all I could think about was getting out, escaping this nightmare. So, we kept moving, even though it felt like we were going in circles. Every car we passed looked the same, and the landscape around us felt like it was shifting, changing, twisting into something unrecognizable. When the sun finally rose the next morning, we realized how much trouble we were in. We hadn't found our car, hadn't found any exit, and now we were completely disoriented. The rows of cars stretched on endlessly, disappearing into the horizon, and we had no idea which direction to go. Our phones were still dead, and there was no sign of life anywhere. The fight we had that day was inevitable. The stress, the fear, the exhaustion, it all came to a head. We snapped at each other, saying things we didn't mean, blaming each other for a situation neither of us could control. I yelled at Helen, telling her we needed to keep moving, that staying in one place would only make it worse. She shot back, saying I was being reckless, that we needed to conserve our energy and wait for help. But deep down, I think we both knew the truth. No one was coming. There was no help. We were alone, trapped in a place that defied explanation. By the third day, desperation set in. We hadn't eaten or drunk anything since leaving the stadium, and Bud was growing weaker by the hour. That was when we made the decision to break into a car. I remember how it felt, prying open the door of that first car, the guilt and shame gnawing at me as I rummaged through the back seat. But we were desperate, and we had no other choice. We found a pack of water bottles and some old granola bars in the back seat, and we drank and ate in silence, our hunger overriding any sense of morality. I left a note in the car, scribbling an apology on a piece of paper I found in the glove compartment. It felt like the least I could do, though I knew it was meaningless. Whoever owned that car was long gone, if they had ever existed at all. The next few days passed in a blur of exhaustion and hunger. We scavenged what we could from the cars we passed, breaking into vehicles with more ease than I ever thought possible. The guilt I had felt that first time disappeared, replaced by the grim reality of survival. We needed food, we needed water, and there was no one around to stop us. By September 12th, we had walked dozens of miles, our legs aching with every step. Our feet were blistered and raw, and we were on our second pair of shoes by that point. Helen and I barely spoke, the arguments replaced by a heavy silence. We were too tired to fight, too tired to care about anything other than putting one foot in front of the other. We found a conversion van that night and decided to sleep in it. It was a relief to have some semblance of shelter, even if it was temporary. The van had a few blankets in the back, and we wrapped Bud in one, tucking in between us to keep him warm. The van provided some protection from the cold, but it wasn't enough. The batteries were dead, and without heat, the night air seeped in through the cracks in the doors. I don't know how long we stayed in that van, maybe a few days, maybe less. Time had become meaningless by then, a blur of hunger, exhaustion, and fear. The van gave us a chance to rest our legs, but it couldn't offer us any real safety. The food we had found was running out, and the nights were getting colder. Worst of all, Bud wasn't getting the nutrients he needed. I could see the change in him. His little body was growing frailer, his eyes duller. He didn't cry much anymore, and that worried me the most. Eventually the day came when we had no choice but to leave the van behind. The batteries were dead, and the warmth it had once offered was gone. We packed up what little we had and set out again, walking through the endless rows of cars. I don't even know what we were looking for anymore. Maybe some part of me still thought we could find an exit, some way out of this nightmare. But each day, that hope grew dimmer, until it was little more than a flicker in the back of my mind. It was around that time that I started to notice something strange. The cars. There was something wrong with them. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it, but then it hit me. They were older. Not just older models, but physically older. Rusted, decaying. The newest vehicle I saw was from the early 2000s, and even that one looked like it had been sitting there for years, untouched. The paint was peeling, the tires were flat, and the windows were coated in grime. And it wasn't just the cars. The food we found was stale, moldy even. The water tasted metallic, like it had been sitting in the bottles for far too long. It was as if the entire world around us was aging, decaying before our eyes. The realization sent a chill down my spine. How long had we been walking? Had time passed differently here? Was this place consuming us? By the time October rolled around, we had fallen into a grim routine. We walked during the day, scavenging what we could from the cars. At night, we slept wherever we could find shelter. A van, a truck, sometimes even a sedan if it was big enough. Bud rode in a wagon we had found, along with our meager supplies. The little guy was a trooper, never complaining, even when things were at their worst, but I could see it in his eyes. The exhaustion, the hunger. He was growing thinner by the day, and there was nothing we could do to stop it. The weather was still mild, thankfully, but I knew that wouldn't last forever. We were walking toward winter, and if we didn't find a way out soon, the cold would kill us. I tried to keep that thought from Helen, but she knew. We both knew. Then, on October 15th, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The cars. They weren't just older. They were getting older. Every day, the vehicles we passed were from an earlier era. First, it was cars from the 90s, then the 80s. By the end of the month, we were walking through rows of rusted relics from the 70s, their metal bodies crumbling into dust. The change had been so gradual that I hadn't noticed it at first, but now it was undeniable. The world around us was aging, decaying, and we were caught in the middle of it. I didn't tell Helen about the cars right away. I didn't want to scare her. But as the days passed, it became harder and harder to ignore. The food we found was more rotten than fresh, the water more scarce. The vehicles were ancient, their windows shattered, their interiors rotted away. It was as if we were walking through a graveyard of a world long forgotten. Then, on October 30th, we found something that made us turn back. We had been walking for hours when we came across a line of cars with their windows smashed in. Glass littered the ground like jagged teeth, and the sight of it filled me with an overwhelming sense of dread. Up until that point, we hadn't seen any sign of violence, any indication that someone or something had been through here before us, but now it felt like we were being hunted. That was the tipping point. Helen and I both agreed. We needed to turn back. Whatever was waiting for us ahead was worse than what we had already seen, but when we tried to retrace our steps, to head back toward the stadium, it was as if the parking lot had swallowed our path. The way back was gone, and no matter how hard we tried, we couldn't find it. We were trapped, caught in some endless maze of metal and asphalt, with no way out. It was around that time that I started to suspect something darker was at play. This wasn't just a parking lot. It was something else, something alive, and it was keeping us here. I tested my theory one night by marking a car as we passed it. I etched a small symbol into the metal, thinking that if we ever came back that way, we'd see it and know we were going in circles. But the next morning, when I tried to find the car again, it was gone. Not just the mark, the car itself had disappeared. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This place wasn't just trapping us, it was changing. The landscape itself was shifting, twisting, making it impossible for us to find our way. I couldn't shake the feeling that the lot was alive in some way, that it was actively working against us. I didn't tell Helen about the disappearing car. She was already scared enough, and I didn't want to add to her stress, but the knowledge weighed on me, pressing down like a heavy weight on my chest. We were losing control, and there was nothing I could do about it. By November 2nd, it was clear that going back wasn't an option. The lot wouldn't let us. So we did the only thing we could. We stayed put. We found a small clearing between a few vans and decided to make camp. It wasn't much, but it gave us a small sense of security in an otherwise hostile environment. I erected a flagpole out of some scrap metal and tied a shirt to it, hoping that if anyone else was out there, they might see it and come to our aid. But no one came. The nights were the worst. The cold seeped in through the cracks in the vans, and we huddled together for warmth, trying to conserve what little energy we had left. I spent hours each day scavenging for food and water, but it was becoming harder and harder to find anything edible. The cars were getting older, the food more rotten, and I started to wonder if we were the only ones left in this place. Then, on January 5th, something happened that shattered the fragile peace we had built. I woke up early that morning, just before dawn, and stepped outside the van to relieve myself. The ground was covered in a thin layer of snow, the first we had seen since the weather started to turn. I remember thinking how peaceful it looked, the way the snow blanketed the ground, softening the harsh lines of the cars around us. But then I saw them, the footprints. They were everywhere, crisscrossing the snow in a chaotic pattern, bare feet, a couple of different sizes, some large, some small. The tracks led all around our camp, circling the vans, lingering near the windows. They had been watching us while we slept. Panic surged through me, and I rushed back into the van, checking on Helen and Bud. They were both still asleep, oblivious to the danger outside. I didn't wake them. Instead, I sat by the window, my heart pounding in my chest, staring out into the darkness, waiting for whatever had made those footprints to return. They never did, at least not that night. The next morning I told Helen about the footprints. She was understandably upset, her face pale as she took in the information. "We need to leave," she said, her voice trembling. "If we leave now, maybe they won't be able to follow us. This place, it doesn't let you go back, but maybe we can find somewhere else to hide." I didn't want to leave. In my mind, this place had become more than just a shelter. It was our home. We had worked so hard to make it safe, to carve out a small piece of normalcy in this twisted world, and I wasn't ready to give that up. "We're better off staying here," I argued. "At least here we have some protection. Out there we'd be completely exposed." Helen reluctantly agreed to stay, though I could tell she wasn't happy about it. She had always been the level-headed one, the calm in the storm, but even she was starting to crack under the pressure. Over the next few days, we did our best to fortify our camp. We moved a few more vehicles to create a barrier around us, using them to block off any potential entry points. I even found a small solar panel in the back of one of the vans, which I rigged up to power a few lights and a portable heater. It wasn't much, but it was something. At night, we sat around watching old DVDs I had scavenged, trying to forget the terror lurking just outside our walls. But the peace didn't last. On the night of January 9th, they came back. I woke up to Bud crying. The sound jolted me out of a deep sleep, and I stumbled to my feet, disoriented and groggy. The van was cold, the air thick with tension, and something was wrong, terribly wrong. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw it. A hand, a pale, withered hand, reaching through one of the van's shattered windows, groping blindly in the direction of Bud's cries. Without thinking, I lunged forward. Adrenaline surged through me, my body moving on pure instinct. I grabbed the arm, twisting it violently against the window frame. There was a sickening crack, the sound of bone snapping, but there was no scream, no cry of pain from whoever, or whatever, owned that arm. It just wrenched itself free, retreating into the darkness as silently as it had come. My heart pounded in my chest, my breathing ragged. I stood there, staring at the broken window, half expecting the figure to return, but the only sound was the soft whimper of Bud, now clutched tightly in Helen's arms. She was crouched in the corner, trying to soothe him, her face pale and drawn. "We can't stay here anymore," she whispered, her voice trembling with fear and frustration. "We need to leave. We should have left the first time." I didn't argue with her. She was right. I had made a mistake by staying, by thinking we could carve out a safe haven in this place. The lot wasn't going to let us be. It was going to drive us mad, or worse. The next day, we packed what little we had left and left the camp behind. The world around us had grown even stranger, even more nightmarish. The cars we passed were relics from another time, ancient models from the 1960s and 1950s, their metal shells rusted and crumbling, their windows shattered. Some were barely recognizable as vehicles, their bodies reduced to piles of decayed metal. Food was nearly impossible to find now, and water even more so. We hadn't seen a working vehicle in weeks, and the little wagon we had used to carry Bud was falling apart. He was getting weaker by the day, his frail body struggling to keep up with the endless walking, the lack of proper nutrition. My heart ached every time I looked at him, but I didn't know what else to do. The nights were the worst. Every time we found a place to rest, we would hear them, those pale, silent figures moving through the darkness just beyond our sight. They never attacked outright, never showed themselves fully, but we could feel them watching. They were always there, just out of reach, waiting for us to make a mistake. And then one night we made that mistake. We had taken shelter in an old contractor's van, It seemed perfect. No windows in the rear, plenty of space to stretch out. We thought we'd be safe, at least for the night, but we hadn't noticed that the locks on the back doors were broken. I woke to the sound of bare feet slapping against the asphalt, followed by a low, guttural growl. My heart leapt into my throat as I realized what was happening. They were here, and they weren't alone this time. I nudged Helen awake, and she sat up instantly, her body tense with fear. We couldn't see them, but we could hear them, moving around the van, their ragged breaths fogging the windows. Bud whimpered in Helen's arms, his tiny body trembling with fear. We huddled together, listening as the creatures circled the van, their movements slow and deliberate. I held my breath, praying that they would leave us alone, that they wouldn't try to get inside. But then the front window shattered. Bud screamed, his tiny voice piercing the night as the creatures began their assault. The van rocked violently from side to side as they slammed into it, their fists pounding against the metal walls, their screeches echoing in the night. I fumbled for the revolver I had found weeks earlier, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold on to it. The back doors flew open with a crash, and suddenly they were upon us, pale, emaciated figures, their eyes wild with hunger, their hands clawing at us. Helen screamed, kicking at the hands that grabbed at her, clutching Bud tightly to her chest. I fired into the mass of bodies, the gun recoiling in my hands as I emptied the chamber. One of the creatures fell, but there were too many of them. I swung wildly, my fists connecting with flesh as I fought to keep them away from my family. For a brief moment amidst the chaos, Helen and I locked eyes. I could see the fear in her gaze, the desperation. Then, with a sudden burst of strength, she shoved Bud toward me. "Take him!" she screamed. "Run!" Before I could react, they were on her, dragging her out of the van, pulling her into the darkness. Her screams echoed in the night, growing fainter and fainter until they disappeared completely. I froze, paralyzed by fear and disbelief. Helen was gone. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the spot where she had been. It felt like an eternity, the weight of my failure pressing down on me, crushing me. But then Bud's cries broke through my shock, and I knew I couldn't stay there. I grabbed him and ran as fast as my legs could carry me, not knowing where I was going, just needing to get away from that place. We ran for what felt like hours, my lungs burning, my legs aching, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. When we finally collapsed in the shadow of a rusted-out car, I held Bud close, my heart breaking as I realized what had just happened. Helen was gone. I had failed her. The next few weeks were a blur of grief and survival. Bud and I kept moving, though each day grew harder than the last. The cars were older now, relics from the 1930s and 1940s, barely recognizable as vehicles anymore. The landscape around us had changed too. The asphalt was giving way to dirt and grass, patches of green sprouting up between the cracks. It felt like we were walking backward through time, the world around us regressing, decaying. Food and water were nearly impossible to find. We scavenged what we could, but most of it was spoiled, rotten, or completely gone. Bud grew weaker and weaker, his little body wasting away before my eyes. I tried to keep him alive, tried to give him the food we found, but it wasn't enough. He was slipping away, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. On February 29th, or at least I think it was February 29th, Bud died. He didn't cry, didn't make a sound. He just wrapped his tiny fingers around mine and snuggled in close, his body cold and frail. I stroked his hair, whispered to him that everything was going to be okay, even though I knew it wasn't. His breathing grew softer, slower, until it finally stopped. I buried him in a shallow grave, using a rock to mark the spot. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. I should have died that day. I should have joined him, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Some part of me, the part that Helen had always loved, kept me going, kept me walking through that endless wasteland of cars and death. Days turned into weeks. I don't know how long I wandered after that. The cars had all but disappeared by then, replaced by patches of grass and dirt. The asphalt was gone, the world around me a strange, barren landscape, devoid of any sign of civilization. I was starving, weak, barely able to put one foot in front of the other, but then, one day, I saw something that gave me hope. A modern car. It was parked in the middle of a large patch of asphalt, pristine and untouched. I don't know how it got there, or why it was the only car for miles, but I didn't care. I stumbled toward it, my legs barely holding me up, and smashed the window with a rock. I crawled inside, my body shaking with exhaustion and hunger, and collapsed into the seat. That's when I heard it, the sound of seagulls. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. Seagulls, here, in this place. I crawled out of the car and looked around, my eyes scanning the horizon, and there, in the distance, I saw it. Streetlights, glowing faintly in the twilight, buildings rising up from the ground, a highway stretching out into the distance. I couldn't believe it. I had found my way out. After all this time, all the walking, all the suffering, I had finally made it back to the real world. But as I stood there, staring at the lights in the distance, I realized something. It wasn't over, not for me. Helen was still out there, somewhere in that twisted, decaying lot. I had to find her. I had to go back. I'm sorry for your window. Take this journal. I hope you never have to experience what I've been through, but if you do, if you find yourself in that place, know this. The lot is real, and it doesn't let go easily. But there is a way out. I have to go back. Helen could still be alive. And that was it. The journal ended there abruptly, leaving you with more questions than answers. As you close the worn, leather-bound book, your eyes drift back to the empty parking lot around you, and a sense of dread wells up inside you. You can't shake the unsettling feeling that the man's account, as outlandish as it seems, has touched on something deeply sinister. The echoes of his despair resonate within you, and suddenly you feel acutely aware of your surroundings. The lot feels vast and empty, yet you can't shake the sensation that you are being watched. You can't help but glance nervously over your shoulder, half expecting to see shadows moving just beyond your line of sight. The reality of the situation begins to sink in. You're alone in a strange place, and this journal is a testament to someone else's unimaginable horror. You pull your jacket tighter around you as an unexpected chill runs through you, not just from the cold, but from the foreboding atmosphere surrounding you. With shaky hands, you flip back through the journal, rereading the entries in a desperate attempt to find some clue, some insight into the man's experience. The words jump off the page, vividly painting a picture of fear, loss, and the raw instinct to survive in a world that no longer makes sense. As you delve deeper into his thoughts, you can almost feel the weight of his despair, the fear of losing everything he held dear. You take a deep breath, trying to steady your nerves. There must be a rational explanation for what you've just read, you tell yourself. Surely this is a work of fiction, some bizarre art project meant to provoke thought or fear. Yet as you scan the empty expanse of the lot, the nagging doubts refuse to leave you. Maybe it's the isolation playing tricks on your mind, but something tells you that the tale is not just fiction. It feels too real, too raw. You can almost picture the family, the parents, desperate to protect their child, caught in a nightmare of their own making. The stark reality of their situation hits you hard. They had faced unimaginable horrors, all while clinging to hope in the face of despair. In a moment of clarity, you resolve to leave the lot. You take one last look at the journal, its pages filled with raw emotion, a poignant reminder of the struggle for survival in a world gone mad. With a deep breath, you tuck it under your arm and start walking, your heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. As you walk, the air grows colder, and the dim light of day begins to fade. Shadows stretch across the pavement, and the looming darkness fills you with dread. Every step feels heavier, as if the very ground beneath you is pulling you back, urging you to return to the safety of the lot. But you refuse to succumb to the fear. You walk faster, your breath coming in sharp gasps. The road ahead twists and turns, revealing glimpses of what might lie beyond the parking lot. You can see outlines of buildings in the distance, their windows glowing with warmth. But as you draw closer, the shadows deepen, and the feeling of being watched intensifies. Suddenly, you hear a noise, soft but unmistakable. Footsteps. The sound is coming from behind you, echoing in the stillness of the night. You turn, and for a moment, you see nothing. The lot is empty, save for the remnants of abandoned cars, their shapes distorted in the low light. Your heart races as you break into a run. Panic surges through you, pushing you to move faster, to escape whatever is lurking in the shadows. You navigate through the rows of cars, your mind racing as you search for an exit, any exit. But the labyrinthine paths of the parking lot seem to conspire against you, twisting and turning, forcing you deeper into its grasp. With each step, the footsteps grow louder, more insistent, as if whatever is behind you is gaining ground. You glance back again, and this time you see them. A figure, pale and gaunt, slipping between the cars like a ghost. Your stomach drops. The realization hits you hard. You are not alone. You push yourself harder, driven by instinct, the desire to survive overpowering your fear. The darkness closes in around you, but you refuse to look back. The only thing you can focus on is the flickering lights in the distance, the promise of safety and warmth. As you round a corner, you spot an opening, a way out. The end of the parking lot. Hope surges within you, igniting a desperate energy that propels you forward. You sprint toward the light, your heart pounding in your chest. But just as you reach the opening, you feel a sharp pain in your leg, a sudden jolt of electricity that sends you sprawling to the ground. You twist to see what caused it, and your blood runs cold. The figure from before is there, standing just beyond the shadows, its expression twisted in a grotesque smile. With a surge of adrenaline, you scramble to your feet and dive for the opening, your breath coming in ragged gasps. You burst through the gap and tumble onto the asphalt beyond, gasping for air. The lights are brighter here, and the familiar sounds of the city fill your ears. But you can't stop. You can't look back. You force yourself to keep moving, running toward the safety of the buildings, your mind racing. The figure lingers at the edge of the parking lot, watching you with those hollow eyes, and a wave of terror washes over you. You pick up your pace, sprinting toward the warmth of the streetlights. Finally, you reach the sidewalk, collapsing against the cold, hard surface. You look back at the parking lot, your heart pounding as you try to catch your breath. The figure is gone, swallowed by the shadows. You're free, at least for now. But the memory of the lot lingers in your mind, haunting you. You know that what you experienced was real, and you can't shake the feeling that the darkness isn't finished with you yet. You may have escaped, but the shadow of the lot looms large, a reminder that some places are not meant to be escaped from easily. As you pull yourself to your feet, you clutch the journal tightly to your chest. It's a piece of the past you can't let go of. You take a moment to gather your thoughts, trying to process everything you've just experienced. The eerie silence of the parking lot, the haunted whispers of the family trapped inside, and the dark figure that seemed to rise from the shadows. But you know you can't dwell on it. You have to move forward. You take a deep breath and head into the glow of the city, the vibrant life pulsing around you. Yet, even as you walk, you can't shake the feeling that you've merely scratched the surface of a larger nightmare. You'll need to be vigilant, always watching over your shoulder, for the darkness has a way of creeping back in when you least expect it. And as you merge with the bustling crowd, you glance back one last time at the parking lot, the place that held so many secrets, so much despair. You can still see the faint outline of the lot against the horizon, a haunting reminder of the unknown. The journal, heavy in your hands, serves as both a warning and a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. You walk forward, knowing that the journey ahead will not be easy. The world may be dark and full of shadows, but you are determined to find your way through, to embrace the light that still exists beyond the gloom. You will not forget, you will not lose hope, and most importantly, you will never let the shadows claim you again. Underneath everything I've touched, everything I've seen, everything I've become, there lies a moment sharp as glass, where it all hits me like a scream trapped within the walls of my mind, and there it is, staring me in the face. Escape was never an option, not really. From the second Danica aimed her cursed lens at that forsaken town, the moment we all stepped into that murky, dead-eyed void, it was sealed, fate or something far worse locked into place. And now, here I sit, tangled in the noise that fills my head, a cacophony of 1,000 voices clawing at my skull, the rancid stench of death curling in my nostrils and choking me. Isn't it strange how the mind works? Clarity can emerge right when you're on the verge of ripping your own skin off, just to stop feeling it. But this isn't just something hunting me from the outside. No, it's inside me. It is me. That's the part I can't untangle. How do I even begin to explain what it feels like to fall apart like this? To feel your mind unravel thread by fragile thread, as though someone is yanking on a loose seam, pulling your thoughts apart with every breath you take. Each whisper, a small, snapping thread in a tapestry of madness. But you need to hear it, don't you? Someone has to know. It all started, I think, with the fog. We drove up that mountain in near silence, the atmosphere thick with an unspoken tension, only interrupted by the occasional forced conversation, peppered through the air like a bad joke that nobody really wanted to laugh at. You know that kind of talk, the type people engage in when they're too afraid to acknowledge the creeping dread beneath their skin, fear that's still small enough to hide behind tight smiles and hollow laughs. Danica was buried in her notes, scribbling furiously like a madwoman, muttering under her breath as though she were in a trance. She was rehearsing, preparing for the grand vision of the documentary that had us all ensnared. That was her way, flitting between being perfectly in control and teetering on the brink of snapping. It was magnetic in a terrifying way. That same force that had pulled me into her orbit now felt more like a noose tightening with every mile we climbed into those mist-drenched mountains. Nathan, though, he felt it too. He kept glancing back at me, his eyes wide and glassy, as if he was waiting for me to say something, to give him an out. But I didn't. No one did. Not a single one of us could articulate what we were all thinking, that we were afraid of something we couldn't even name. Then we reached it, the town. It didn't have a name anymore, not that we knew of. Once, perhaps, it had been a place people spoke about, a dot on some forgotten map, a whisper of a memory in a history book no one bothered to read. But now it was nothing more than a graveyard of rotting houses, crumbling under the weight of fog that clung to the air like a wet shroud, suffocating. The scent of decay, wood, dirt, and something foul clung to the air, curling its way into my throat, choking me. And God, the silence. It was overwhelming. No birds, no wind, just nothing. Except for something else. A whisper. Faint and far off, threading its way through the quiet. I couldn't make out the words, and maybe that's why it was so terrifying. Danica, predictably, was the first to break the silence. "This is perfect," she breathed, her eyes wide with a sick kind of excitement. It made me want to vomit, but I didn't say anything. I just watched as she pulled out her camera, her eyes gleaming with that twisted ambition. I wanted to scream at her, to tell her to put it down, but I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I stayed quiet and followed as she filmed the ghost of a place long forgotten. That's when I saw him. An old man stood in the doorway of one of the houses, hidden just enough in the shadows that I almost didn't catch him at first. His skin was stretched too tight, pale as paper, and his eyes, those eyes, they were empty, hollow. He just stared at us. "Hello there," Danica called out, her voice too bright, like she was trying to shatter the tension with forced cheer. "We're filmmakers. Do you have a moment?" The man didn't move. He didn't blink. He just stepped back into the darkness without a word. We should have left. Nathan's eyes met mine, wide and pleading, but I said nothing, and deeper we went. Into the mist. Into the nightmare. That night, the whispers started. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, a trick of the mountains, but then they grew louder, more insistent. I lay there in my sleeping bag, frozen, staring into the dark, listening. And then I heard my name. "Alex?" I shot upright, my heart pounding, but Nathan was still sound asleep. Danica's tent was silent. I tried to tell myself I was imagining things, but I knew. I had heard it. The next day, things got worse. The locals, the ones who hadn't vanished into the fog, were strange, hollow, like the old man. They spoke, but their words were dead, rehearsed, almost mechanical. There were warnings, quiet mutters about leaving. "Before it finds you." Then Nathan vanished. No word, no warning, just gone. When we found him, it was like stepping into a nightmare. He was strung up between two trees, his skin peeled back in delicate strips, eyes wide open, like he was still trapped inside his own corpse, aware of the horror but unable to escape it. Danica didn't cry, didn't scream. She filmed. And I stood there, frozen. The camera lens captured Nathan's lifeless form, and in that moment, I felt something inside me crack. The whispers, they were louder now, relentless. Each night, they crept closer, coiling around my brain, prying at the edges of my sanity. I'd hear my name, clear as day, called out from somewhere just beyond the fog. Alex. Soft, teasing, like fingers running down my spine. I tried to ignore them. I tried to sleep. But it's impossible to sleep when something is inside your head, gnawing at your thoughts like a hungry animal. That's when Danica changed. It was subtle at first, a tension in her shoulders, a flicker of something dark behind her eyes. The camera, the damn camera, never left her side, like it was glued to her hand. She didn't eat. She barely slept. Her obsession had always been there, simmering beneath the surface. But now, it consumed her. She spent hours standing at the edge of the trees, staring into the fog, muttering under her breath. I don't know what she was saying. I didn't want to know. Then one night I woke up to the sound of her voice. Alex. I bolted upright, heart hammering, but she was nowhere near me. No, she was standing at the edge of the clearing, her back to me, her camera dangling from one limp hand. The fog swirled around her feet, thick and sluggish, almost alive. I called her name, but she didn't respond. She just stood there, whispering. I stumbled out of the tent, my legs weak, my head spinning. Danica? My voice barely came out, trembling, broken. She didn't move. Alex, she said again, but her voice, it wasn't coming from her. It was too close, too soft, like it was being dragged from some far-off place. I approached her slowly, the damp earth squelching beneath my boots. She didn't turn around. Her body was unnaturally still, stiff, like a mannequin propped up in some twisted display. Come with me, she whispered, her voice low and distant, as though it were being pulled from the depths of the fog. You need to see. Her head turned toward me, slowly, too slowly, and when I saw her face, my blood ran cold. It wasn't her. Her eyes, they were too wide, too glassy, like they didn't belong to her anymore. Her skin seemed too tight, stretched thin over her bones, pulling her mouth into a grotesque, forced smile, and then she turned without another word and began walking into the trees. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But something pulled me forward. Some invisible thread yanked me along after her, one step at a time, deeper into the fog. My body moved on its own, my legs heavy, numb, like I was walking underwater. The forest closed in around us. The branches overhead twisted together, trapping us in a cage of wood and fog. The air was thick with it, so thick I could hardly breathe, each step pulling me deeper into some unseen horror. Danica stopped in front of an ancient tree, its bark blackened and cracked, the branches above like skeletal arms reaching into the dark sky. She didn't move, didn't blink, she just stared. And then she began to peel. Her fingers dug into her own face, nails sinking into her flesh, and she pulled. The skin came away easily, too easily, as if it had never really been hers. No scream, no sound, just the wet, sickening noise of skin tearing from muscle. I wanted to run, to turn away, but my body wouldn't listen. I was trapped in place, rooted to the spot by the sheer, suffocating terror of it all. I stood there, my heart racing, as I watched her strip herself down, revealing the raw, glistening muscle beneath, her eyes still wide, still empty. Then she turned toward me, her skinless face gleaming in the moonlight, and smiled that same twisted, unnatural smile. Come closer, she whispered, her voice too sweet, too soft, as though she were offering me a gift. I want to show you something. I tried to shake my head, to back away, but my body wouldn't obey. I was stuck in place, paralyzed by fear, as the thing that had once been Danica crouched down beside me, her grotesque form barely illuminated by the dim light filtering through the fog. Don't you want to see? She cooed, her voice a sickening blend of coaxing and command. Don't you want to understand? As I stood frozen, I felt the cold tendrils of dread wrap around my heart. I wanted to scream, to run, to escape from the nightmare unfolding before me, but instead I was drawn closer, inching forward against my will, captivated by the horror and morbid fascination of it all. Look at me, Alex, she urged, her voice softening to a whisper that resonated deep within me. Look at what we are now. I could only stare in horrified fascination as she continued to peel away the remnants of her skin, exposing the raw muscle and sinew underneath. Blood pooled at her feet, a dark, glistening puddle reflecting the pale moonlight. The once vibrant girl I had known was gone, replaced by this grotesque caricature of life. "Please, stop!" I finally managed to choke out, my voice barely a whisper, but she only laughed. A sound that echoed in the stillness around us, a cruel mockery of laughter. "You don't understand," she said, tilting her head, her skeletal face inches from mine. "This is freedom. This is what we've become." Suddenly she lunged forward, her hands grasping at my skin, and instinct kicked in. I stumbled backward, tearing myself away from her grasp, a primal fear surging through me. The moment I broke contact, the spell was shattered. My mind cleared and I turned to run, my legs pumping hard against the soft, wet ground. "Alex!" she called, her voice trailing after me, a sickly sweet sing-song lilt that sent shivers racing down my spine. "You can't run from what you are." The trees closed in around me as I sprinted through the fog, branches clawing at my face, dragging against my skin like angry fingers. I could feel the weight of the whispers wrapping around me, pulling me back, urging me to stop. "Join us, Alex," they hissed, echoing in my ears. "You belong here. You are one of us now." I ran faster, forcing my legs to move despite the heaviness weighing me down. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a reminder of the life I was desperately clinging to. I pushed deeper into the woods, hoping to lose them in the maze of trees, but the whispers only grew louder, more insistent, clawing at the edges of my sanity. "Alex," they called, threading through the fog, wrapping around my thoughts like a twisted vine. "Come back. Embrace what you are." I burst through a thicket, emerging into a small clearing where the fog lifted slightly, revealing a glimpse of the moonlight. I could see the remnants of the town through the trees, decaying houses, their windows dark and hollow, like the eyes of the lost souls that once inhabited them. In the distance, I spotted a glimmer of hope. An old car, its headlights dim but flickering, as if it were somehow still alive, still holding on. My instincts kicked in. If I could reach it, maybe I could escape. Maybe I could get away from this hell. I sprinted toward it, my breath coming in gasps as the whispers receded into the background, momentarily silenced by the thought of freedom. The car was a rusted relic, but the door creaked open with a push. I jumped inside, slamming the door behind me, my heart racing as I fumbled for the keys. But they weren't there. I looked around frantically, searching the dashboard, the glove compartment, anything that might give me a chance to start it. But the car was dead, lifeless, just like everything else in this forsaken place. Then the whispers returned, flooding my mind with a deafening roar. "You can't escape, Alex," they taunted. "You are one of us. You were always one of us." I pressed my hands against my ears, trying to drown them out, trying to push the voices away. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat, choked by the overwhelming fear and despair. I glanced out the window, half expecting to see Danica standing there, her skinless form waiting to drag me back into the darkness. But instead, I saw them, the townspeople, a group of hollow-eyed figures emerging from the trees, their movements slow and deliberate, shuffling closer to the car. Their mouths moved in silent whispers, and I could feel the weight of their empty stares boring into me. "Let us in, Alex," they murmured in unison, their voices a haunting melody. "Join us. You belong with us." Panic surged within me, and I grabbed the door handle, ready to flee again. But then the fog thickened, swirling around the car, obscuring my vision. It enveloped the figures, distorting their shapes until they were nothing more than shadows creeping toward me, slipping between the gaps in the car's frame. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to calm down. I needed to think. I needed to find a way out of this nightmare. With a sudden burst of determination, I grabbed the old steering wheel and twisted it with all my strength, hoping against hope that I could somehow will the car back to life. Nothing happened. I cursed under my breath, slamming my fist against the dashboard in frustration. The whispers grew louder, drowning out my thoughts, their presence pressing in on me. I could feel the fear creeping back, tightening its grip around my heart. But then I remembered. The camera. Danica had been obsessed with capturing everything, recording our descent into madness. Maybe it still held something, some last vestige of hope, some way to reach out for help. I rummaged through the glove compartment, tossing aside crumpled papers and empty water bottles until I found it, the camera. I clutched it tightly in my hands, my heart racing as I flipped it on. The screen flickered to life, casting a dim glow in the dark car. I hit the record button, breathing heavily as I spoke into the lens, my voice trembling. "If anyone finds this, please. We need help. We're trapped in this town. Something is wrong. Something is hunting us." I glanced out the window again, and the townspeople were closer now, their movements unnervingly slow, their mouths twisting into those sickly, familiar smiles. I continued speaking into the camera, desperation creeping into my voice. "Please, you have to believe me. We're not safe here. They're changing us." Suddenly, a knock on the window jolted me back to reality. I turned to see one of the townspeople staring at me, their eyes vacant and lifeless. I couldn't breathe as they raised a hand to the glass, their fingers pressing against it like they were trying to reach inside. "Let us in, Alex," they whispered, their voice a chilling echo of everything I feared. "You know you want to." In a panic, I slammed the camera down and grabbed the door handle again, ready to escape, ready to run back into the woods. But as I pulled the door open, I was met with a thick wall of fog that rushed in, swirling around me, suffocating. The fog coiled around my legs, pulling me down, and I felt the whispers grow louder, a relentless tide of voices rising in a crescendo of madness. "Join us! Embrace what you are, you cannot escape." With a final, desperate cry, I pushed through the fog, trying to escape the weight of their voices, the horrors they promised awaited me. I staggered backward, the fog thickening until I could hardly see. I turned, stumbling blindly into the darkness, my mind racing. Then I felt it. A hand grasping my shoulder, pulling me back. I whipped around, ready to fight, but the figure was gone, just a fleeting shadow lost in the fog. My heart raced as I stumbled forward, deeper into the trees. "Alex?" The voice called again, soft and seductive, wrapping around me like a serpent. "You belong to us." I forced myself to run, to push through the whispers, through the fog, through the suffocating fear that threatened to swallow me whole. Each step felt heavier, like the ground was pulling me back, but I wouldn't give in. I couldn't. I burst through the trees into another clearing, the moonlight pouring down around me like a lifeline. I glanced. Yes, my landlord is a creep. This much is obvious, but that doesn't mean I'm above using his lustful impulses to my advantage. For a few months, my arrangement with him had been nothing short of splendid. My bank account was growing pleasantly chubby, and I felt a strange power in the situation. But recently, everything went downhill. Before I get ahead of myself, I should explain how our little agreement came about. I live in an apartment complex filled with dozens of residents, a bustling hive of activity that usually kept me distracted. The landlord, Jared, lived just a few doors down from my apartment. You can imagine how often I'd walk by, trying to avoid eye contact while he leered through his window like a starving wolf. Any time I walked past, he'd dart up to the glass, his gaze drinking me in from head to toe, but his eyes always seemed to linger around my shoes. It was unsettling, and I was growing sick of it. I often considered moving out entirely, tired of being the object of his fixation. But one fateful day, everything changed. As I returned from the gym, feeling fresh and empowered, I was startled when the apartment doors swung open. Jared stood in the frame, his expression almost predatory, visibly salivating as he laid eyes on my sneakers. I gripped the small bottle of mace on my keychain, ready to spray him in the face if he dared to come any closer. Instead, he suddenly darted to his pocket. I flinched, pointing the mace in his direction, but then I heard the distinct sound of crinkling bills. "Whoa, whoa," he announced, revealing a wad of cash in his hand, his other palm facing me in surrender. He made eye contact, then let his gaze fall to my feet, practically vibrating with anticipation. I could feel my stomach churn. With an unsettling smile, he slowly bent over and placed $300 bills on the ground between us, stepping back as if I were a wild animal that could snap at any moment. When he was far enough away, he pointed back at my feet, his eyes almost glazed over. "I'll trade you for those." My shoes?" I questioned, completely confused. "No, your socks," he replied, his eyes widening in a grotesque excitement as he said the word socks. A wave of disgust washed over me, and I could feel the bile rise in my throat. Ew, the fuck. No, I shot back, my conviction as sassy as I could muster. Just as I turned to leave, Jared made a counteroffer. Wait, I'll make it worth your while. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out 2 more crisp $100 bills. $500 for a pair of dirty, worn gym socks. I had heard that some guys fetishized women's feet, but damn, I never imagined my own sweaty, gnarled socks could garner this much compensation. While the offer intrigued me, the thought of handing over my socks, my personal belongings, for him to do who knows what with, made me hesitate. He must have noticed my indecision because he continued to sweeten the deal. Tell you what, I'll cover your rent every month if you just leave your worn socks at my door every time you walk by. His eyes remained fixed on me, unwavering and dead serious. My jaw dropped at his offer, and a smile crept across his face as he realized he had me. Before anyone judges me, let me explain. My rent was $1,500. As a broke college student, this man was offering me something I couldn't refuse. I bent down to unlace my sneakers, and I swear I could hear his heart pounding out of his chest. Or was it mine? I had never done anything like this before, so you can imagine the conflicting emotions swirling inside me. I pulled my sweaty socks off my feet, and a twinkle formed in his eyes as my toes met the open air. His lust-filled stare made me scrunch my toes away, pressing them against the hot, midday concrete. I tossed my moist, balled-up socks into his waiting hands. He eagerly picked up the money and handed it over to me. I was slightly confused. He said he'd cover my rent, but was also handing me $500. My face must have screamed confusion because he quickly clarified. Think of this as a tip. I was shocked. When I didn't take the money, he laid it back on the ground and slowly stepped back into his apartment, shutting the door with a quiet click. I hesitated before picking the cash off the ground, still reeling from the encounter. I had just become a few $100s richer and relieved of my rent burden. However, I couldn't shake the feeling of guilt gnawing at me for agreeing to this. As the weeks went on, I stayed true to our agreement. Each time I passed Jared's office, I would stop, remove my socks, and place them at his door. To my surprise, Jared abided by our agreement as well. In fact, he exceeded my expectations. Anytime I left my sweaty gym socks at his door, I would find an envelope wedged into the crack of my own door, usually accompanied by some creepy message saying something like, "Keep them coming." But behind his notes was always a large tip. I don't care who you are. If someone throws money at you for something so absurd, you're going to take it. One day, I decided to wear a pair of flip-flops for a quick run to the grocery store, my first departure from the routine since our arrangement started. When I returned, I had nothing to lay at Jared's door. I didn't think it would matter much. I had given him a few dozen pairs of socks by now, but I was wrong. As I approached my apartment, Jared rushed out, his expression a mixture of panic and fury. "What are you doing? Where are the socks?" His outburst made me cower inside my hoodie, but as I looked into his eyes, I could see fear rather than anger. I don't wear socks with flip-flops," I said in a shaky tone. Jared gripped his hair in frustration and let out a primal scream that echoed through the corridor. "You don't know what you've done. I'm going to have to pay for this." From behind him wafted a pungent reek of body odor. I surmised it was the weeks of dirty socks lying around his apartment, but as I glanced over Jared's shoulder, I noticed a figure resting atop his couch, dressed in quilt-like garments. As my eyes adjusted, the figure became clearer. It wasn't an actual person, but a life-size doll, stitched from the very socks I had given him over the weeks. It faced a small TV, and I could tell Jared had just been snuggled up to the doll because the cushion next to it held the distinct impression of his backside. My ears began to ring at the creepy sight. Jared noted my gaze and moved to dispel any misconceptions about the situation. "It's not what it looks like," he said, showing me his clean palms. When my gaze didn't break contact with the doll, he tried to distract me with his body, stepping in front of my line of sight. The doll briefly disappeared behind Jared's frame, but as I craned to see it, it moved. The doll's head slowly pivoted away from the TV and looked toward the door. A woman's monotone voice came from the faceless figure. Honey, did she bring some more? My senses were overloaded. I instantly went into flight mode and darted off toward my apartment. As I ran, I heard Jared pleading for mercy. "No, please, honey, I'll make it up to you," he begged. But as the door creaked closed behind me, I heard several loud bangs and Jared's anguished screams. For the next week, I was too scared to walk by Jared's door. I opted to take the long way around to the parking lot whenever I needed to go somewhere. But as much as I tried avoiding Jared, I had this strange feeling that he was watching me, a suspicion quickly confirmed when I ran some trash to the dumpster. As I tossed the garbage bags into the container, I had a feeling that someone was staring at me from the far end of the apartment's walls. I don't know what got into me, but as I walked around the opposite end of the building, I pressed my body against the masonry, waiting for whoever was spying on me to step out into the open. Jared scurried out of the shadows and made his way over to the dumpster. He didn't hesitate to jump in, tossing out the garbage bags I had just disposed of. When they landed on the pavement, he ripped them open, presumably looking for old socks. I, however, knew he wouldn't find any. He already had all my old, worn-out socks, and I wouldn't be tossing out any more for some time. But as Jared pulled out the contents of my bathroom disposables, I saw his eyes gleam with excitement. He had found my toenail clippings. My skin crawled when he pressed them against his face, caressing them as if they were a godsend. I couldn't hold back my gasp, and he cocked his head in my direction. When his face met mine, I noticed his left eye was swollen and bruised. Now I knew what punishment had befallen him when I had no socks to give him a week prior. His eyes widened with surprise, and I made a run for it. "Wait! Stop! You don't understand. If I don't get her your socks, she's going to kill us both," he shouted after me, desperation clear in his voice. But I couldn't stop. I didn't want to find out what had happened to him, or what he was referring to. I bolted into my apartment, slamming the door behind me, my heart racing. I leaned against the door, breathing heavily, trying to process everything that had just happened. Jared's plea echoed in my mind. She's going to kill us both. Who was she? Was there truly something more sinister lurking in the shadows? I felt the walls closing in around me, a suffocating weight pressing down as I thought of the doll, stitched together with my discarded socks, and the awful implications that followed. I was a prisoner in my own home. I barricaded myself against the door, half expecting it to burst open at any moment. Jared's voice haunted me, a reminder that whatever darkness was at play was far beyond my control. The days turned into a blur of anxiety. I stayed cooped up in my apartment, afraid to venture outside. My mind played tricks on me. I could swear I heard the whispers of the townspeople creeping through the walls, echoing Jared's chilling words. I tried to keep my thoughts focused on anything else, schoolwork, friends, anything to distract me from the dread that weighed heavily in the air, but it didn't work. By the end of the week, I was nearing my breaking point. I couldn't stay holed up forever. I needed supplies. I needed food. And as much as I wanted to pretend everything was fine, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that Jared, or whatever that doll represented, was waiting for me to make a mistake. I decided to risk a quick trip to the store. As I stepped out into the hallway, I held my breath, straining to listen for any sign of life. But the corridor was silent. Each step toward the stairs felt like an eternity, the air thick with dread. I made it outside, the sunlight hitting my skin like a welcome embrace. I took a moment to breathe deeply, grounding myself in the familiar sights of the apartment complex. But my relief was short-lived. As I walked toward the parking lot, I spotted Jared's apartment door slightly ajar. My heart raced, and I froze. I could hear muffled sounds, pleading, soft cries. My instincts kicked in. I knew I shouldn't approach, but curiosity won out. I stepped closer, peering through the gap in the door. What I saw made my blood run cold. The doll sat in the middle of the living room, propped against the couch, its fabric patchwork glistening in the sunlight. Jared knelt before it, his hands trembling as he held what looked like a small offering, my worn-out socks, damp and crumpled. "Please, honey, I'll make it up to you," he begged, desperation dripping from his voice. "I'll get her what she wants. Just please don't hurt me." I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as I realized he was bargaining with the doll as if it were alive. The whispers grew louder, swirling in my mind, urging me to leave, to get away from this madness before it consumed me too. I turned to leave, but my foot caught on something, and I stumbled, crashing into a nearby flower pot. The sound echoed through the quiet hallway, drawing Jared's attention. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice laced with panic. My heart raced as I darted back toward the stairs, fear propelling me forward. "Wait, don't go!" Jared shouted after me, his voice rising in desperation. "You don't understand." I didn't look back. I sprinted down the stairs, my pulse pounding in my ears. As I reached the front door, I could hear him barreling behind me, his footsteps echoing like thunder. I burst outside, adrenaline surging through my veins. I sprinted toward the parking lot, the sunlight glaring down as I fumbled for my keys. But before I could reach my car, I felt a hand grip my arm, spinning me around. It was Jared, his eyes wild, desperation etched across his face. "You don't get it. You have to help me. She's going to take me." "Help you?" I spat, yanking my arm away from his grasp. "You're insane. What have you done? What is this thing?" His expression shifted from panic to something darker, more sinister. "You don't understand, Alex. It's too late for me. But you can still save yourself. Just give her what she wants." "Who is she?" I demanded, but he didn't answer. Instead, he glanced over his shoulder, eyes wide with terror, as if he could sense something lurking just beyond the veil of reality. The whispers grew louder, filling the air with a cacophony of voices, each one vying for my attention. "Run, Alex, run before it finds you," they hissed. I hesitated, torn between the man I had been dealing with and the creature he had become. "Get away from me, Jared," I said, my voice trembling. But he stepped closer, his face a mask of desperation. "I'm telling you, Alex, you can't escape her. You have to give her what she wants, or you'll be next." "Next for what?" I shouted, panic rising. "What the hell are you talking about?" Suddenly the air around us thickened, the fog rolling in like a living entity. Jared's expression shifted from desperation to a look of sheer horror. "No, she's here!" Before I could react, he turned and bolted back toward his apartment, leaving me standing alone in the parking lot, confusion and dread swirling in my mind. I felt the fog close in around me, wrapping around my ankles like icy fingers, pulling me down. "Alex." The voice was soft, melodic, and impossibly close, sending chills up my spine. I turned to see the doll standing at the edge of the fog, its eyes glistening with a sickening light. "Come closer," it called, its voice a twisted mimicry of everything I feared. "You need to see." My body felt heavy, the fog thickening, constricting my movements. The whispers roared to life in my ears, drowning out my thoughts. "Join us," they urged, a siren's call beckoning me toward the darkness. I stumbled backward, struggling to break free from the fog's grasp, but it was too late. The doll began to move, gliding toward me with an unnatural grace, its limbs bending at odd angles as it approached. "You belong with us, Alex. Embrace your fate." I fought against the suffocating dread, but my body felt like it was betraying me. The whispers grew louder, echoing in my mind, drowning out my resistance. "You are part of this. You can't escape. You've always belonged here." As the doll closed the distance between us, I felt my resolve shatter. I was trapped in this nightmare, bound by the very threads of fear and desperation that had ensnared Jared. I couldn't fight it anymore. With a final desperate gasp, I turned and ran, bolting back toward my apartment, but the fog surged around me, wrapping its tendrils around my limbs, pulling me deeper into the nightmare. I couldn't escape. It was everywhere. The voices were relentless, echoing my name, taunting me as I fought against the suffocating grip of despair. I stumbled into my apartment, slamming the door shut behind me. I pressed my back against it, panting, my heart racing in my chest. The whispers grew quieter now, but I could still feel them lingering at the edges of my mind, waiting for the moment to strike. I looked around my apartment, searching for something, anything that could help me break free from this madness. But the shadows loomed larger, closing in on me, and I knew deep down that I was already ensnared in a web of my own making. I fell to my knees, tears streaming down my face as I realized the truth. I had become a pawn in this twisted game, caught between Jared's lust and the malevolent force that had claimed him, and as the whispers circled around me like vultures, I knew that escape was no longer an option. The thing lurking in the fog was waiting for me, and the only way out was to give in. I was about to become part of the collection, Just another face in the patchwork of horrors that had claimed this cursed place. As I sat there, trembling and terrified, I could only wonder how many others had fallen before me, how many had been consumed by the darkness, and what fate awaited me when my time came. I took a deep breath, steeling myself against the dread that threatened to swallow me whole. I wouldn't go down without a fight, but as the fog pressed against my door, I knew that the time for resistance was slipping away, and the whispers were growing louder, beckoning me to surrender to my fate. And so I waited, knowing that whatever came next would change everything. The darkness was coming, and it was hungry. This expanded narrative offers more character development and atmospheric tension while delving deeper into the protagonist's internal struggles and the unfolding horror around them, the dark influences at play. As the hours passed, the oppressive atmosphere weighed heavily on me. I could feel the air thickening, almost alive, as though the apartment itself was watching and waiting. The whispers lingered in my mind, a constant reminder of the fate that awaited me. I couldn't stay here. I needed to escape. The thought of fleeing, of leaving this nightmare behind, flickered in my mind like a dim candle struggling against the darkness. But where could I go? Every route seemed tainted, every escape plan marred by Jared's lingering presence and the ominous threat of the doll that had become the centerpiece of his grotesque collection. After what felt like an eternity of restless pacing, I glanced at the clock. It was late, too late to be out in the streets alone. Yet, I felt an overwhelming urge to break free, to take action before it was too late. Summoning my courage, I grabbed my phone and tried to call for help. My hands trembled as I dialed my best friend, Jenna. The phone rang and rang, but there was no answer. A sinking feeling of dread washed over me. I couldn't even rely on my friends in this mess. With a heavy heart, I dropped the phone onto the couch and paced the room, desperate to clear my mind. I needed a plan. The fog outside seemed to be thickening, a swirling mass that seemed to pulse with anticipation. I had to confront Jared and find out what this thing truly wanted. If it was as malevolent as Jared suggested, I couldn't allow myself to be taken without a fight. I grabbed my jacket, slipping it on over my tank top, feeling the familiar weight of my mace in my pocket. As I opened the door, the cold air rushed into the apartment, sending a chill down my spine. I hesitated for a moment, listening for any signs of life in the corridor, but all I heard was the low hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, buzzing like angry bees. With a deep breath, I stepped out into the hallway, the dim light casting long shadows that danced across the walls. Each step felt heavier than the last as I approached Jared's door, my heart pounding against my ribs. I knocked lightly, half hoping he wouldn't answer. "Jared," I called, my voice shaking. "Are you in there?" Silence answered me. I waited, straining to hear anything beyond the door. Just when I thought I'd turn back, the door creaked open, revealing Jared standing before me, his eyes wide and hollow, the remnants of fear still lingering on his face. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper, as though speaking too loudly would draw the attention of whatever horror lurked within. "I want to know what's going on," I demanded, trying to sound stronger than I felt. "What did you bring into this place? What is that doll?" He flinched at the mention of the doll, his expression shifting from surprise to dread. "You shouldn't have come here," he murmured, glancing over his shoulder as if afraid of being overheard. "It's not safe." "I don't care. You've been messing with something that's beyond your understanding," I pressed, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "You need to tell me what it wants. Why is it after me?" Jared hesitated, his eyes darting back to the living room, where I could see the faint outline of the doll, still propped on the couch. "It's not just a doll, it's alive in a way. It craves something it lost, and if it doesn't get it, it becomes agitated." "What do you mean, something it lost?" I asked, my heart racing. "What does it want from me?" Jared swallowed hard, his throat bobbing nervously. "It feeds on memories, on the essence of those it takes. Each person adds to its power, to its presence, the socks, your essence. It's not just fabric, it's a part of you." I took a step back, the realization crashing over me like icy water. "You mean it wants my—" "Not just your socks," Jared interjected, desperation creeping into his voice. "It wants your fear, your pain. It thrives on the negative. It wants to consume you, and if you don't appease it, it will find a way to take you too." I felt a chill run through me as the gravity of his words sank in. "And what about you?" I asked, a mixture of anger and fear swirling within me. "Are you just going to let it happen?" He hung his head, shame coloring his features. "I thought I could control it. I thought I could manage it, but it's too powerful. I never wanted this." "Whoa. So what now? Are you going to help me, or are you going to hide behind your doll?" I shot back, my frustration boiling over. "Listen," he said, urgency creeping into his voice. "You have to give it what it wants. It's the only way to keep it at bay, just like I did. If you don't, it will come for you, and there won't be a way out." The fear in his eyes spoke volumes. I knew he was right. I could feel it in my bones. The air around us seemed to grow heavier, charged with the dark energy of the doll. "And what if I refuse?" I challenged, my heart racing. "What if I don't want to be a part of this?" "Then it will consume you," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You don't understand. This thing has taken more lives than you can imagine. You need to protect yourself. I wish I could help you more, but it's not something you can fight with weapons or strength. You must appease it." The walls around us seemed to pulse, the very structure of the building vibrating with the whispers of the townspeople, warning me, beckoning me. I could hear them calling my name, the soft sounds swirling around us, growing louder, drowning out my thoughts. "I don't want to end up like you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to become part of its collection." He stepped closer, desperation etched into his features. "You need to figure out what it desires. If you can appease it, make it think it's getting what it wants, it may let you go, for now, but it's only a temporary solution." I nodded slowly, my mind racing. "Okay," I replied, steeling myself. "I'll try to find out what it wants, but if this goes south, I'll hold you responsible." Jared swallowed hard, his eyes glistening with unspoken fear. "Just be careful. The fog, it knows you're here. It knows." With that ominous warning hanging in the air, I stepped back from his apartment, heart pounding. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for the challenges ahead. The fog swirled outside, beckoning me into its depths, and I knew the time for action was now. As I retreated to my apartment, I felt a surge of determination. I couldn't let this thing take me. I would find a way to confront it and put an end to its reign of terror. In the weeks that followed, I gathered all my courage, observing the doll from a distance whenever I could. I noted its eerie stillness, the way it seemed to watch everything with those lifeless eyes stitched into its fabric. I thought back to Jared's words, desperate to understand what this thing truly wanted. Then one night, as the fog crept in thick and heavy, I made my decision. I would face the doll and confront it directly, hoping to appease whatever dark entity lay within its stitched fabric. I gathered my old worn socks, the ones I had been too afraid to toss aside, and stuffed them into a small backpack. I made my way to Jared's apartment, feeling the weight of fear and anticipation in the pit of my stomach. As I knocked on the door, the whispers grew louder, swirling around me like a storm. "Alex," they beckoned, seductive and ominous, sending shivers down my spine. "Jared," I called, my voice trembling. "I'm here." After a moment of silence, he finally opened the door, his face pale and drawn, a shadow of the man I had spoken to before. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "I have to do this," I said, determination replacing fear. "I need to confront the doll. I need to know what it wants." Jared's expression twisted into a mixture of fear and resignation. "If you're sure, just be careful." He stepped aside, allowing me to enter. Inside, the doll sat eerily in the corner, illuminated by the dim light of a flickering bulb. Its stitched eyes seemed to follow me as I approached, an unsettling weight settling over me. "Why are you doing this?" I whispered to the doll, my voice trembling. "What do you want?" Silence filled the room, and for a moment I thought I would receive no answer. But then I felt it. A pulse, a low thrum of energy radiating from the doll, wrapping around me like an embrace. "You want my essence," I murmured, piecing it together. "You feed on the discarded parts of me." Suddenly, the doll's eyes seemed to glimmer with something resembling understanding. It shifted slightly, and the whispers grew more urgent, coiling around me like a serpent. "Yes," they echoed, a chorus of voices merging into one. "Feed us, give us what we desire." "Whoa." I took a deep breath, steeling my resolve. "What do you desire?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. What will satisfy you? The doll remained still, but I could feel the atmosphere shift. The air grew thick, charged with an energy that felt almost sentient, and the whispers crescendoed, swirling around me in a maddening cacophony. Your essence, they urged. Your fear, your despair. Feed us, and we will let you be. I looked around the room, the shadows creeping in, and I realized the extent of the horror I was confronting. Jared stood to the side, watching with wide eyes, fear etched into his features. I had become the center of attention in this twisted tableau, and I knew I had to make a choice. Fine, I said, my voice trembling but firm. I will give you what you want, but you have to promise me something in return. The doll's eyes glinted in the dim light, and the whispers quieted for just a moment, as if considering my words. What is your price? They hissed, the collective voice laced with curiosity. I want to be free from this. I don't want to become part of your collection. I just want to live my life, I declared, my heart racing as I spoke. You take what you want from me, but you will let me go. Silence fell over the room, and I held my breath, waiting for a response. The doll didn't move, but I could feel the weight of its gaze, pressing into me like a physical force. A bargain, it whispered, its voice dripping with honeyed malice. You shall pay your dues, but we will not keep you yet. The words sent chills down my spine, and I took a step closer to the doll. What do you want from me? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Your essence, it repeated, the collective voice now vibrating with a sense of urgency. Your fear, your despair, your discarded parts. Give us what you no longer need, and we will let you be. In that moment, I understood. The doll didn't just want my physical belongings. It craved the darker parts of my soul, my fears, my regrets, the weight of my insecurities. It wanted to feed on the very essence of my humanity. I hesitated, knowing what I was about to offer was far more valuable than a simple pair of socks. I felt a pang of fear grip my heart, but I steeled my resolve. I could fight this. I had to fight this. All right, I said slowly. I'll give you a part of me, but in return, you will leave me alone. Whoa. The doll's eyes glimmered with something resembling excitement, and I could feel the whispers rising again, filling the air with anticipation. Yes, yes, feed us. I closed my eyes, focusing inward, trying to find the shadows I had buried deep within myself, the fears that haunted my dreams, the regrets that gnawed at my mind. As I delved into that darkness, I felt a heaviness settle over me. Each fear felt like a tangible weight, pressing down on my chest, making it harder to breathe. Take it, I whispered, tears spilling down my cheeks. Take what you want. In that instant, I felt the energy shift around me. The doll seemed to lean closer, and the whispers surged, rushing toward me like a tidal wave. I could feel them pulling at the darker parts of my soul, unraveling the threads that held my fears and regrets in place. Suddenly, I felt a sharp pain, as if something was being ripped from me. My vision blurred, and I gasped as the weight of my fears, my insecurities, began to dissolve, slipping away into the void. The whispers swelled, engulfing me, filling the space around me with a cacophony of sound, their glee palpable. More! We want more! They cried, the urgency rising as the doll's eyes gleamed with hunger. I gasped, the pain intensifying, but I pushed back. No more! That's all I can give! I cried out, feeling as though my very essence was being siphoned away. The connection felt both liberating and terrifying, as though I were teetering on the edge of oblivion. Then we have a bargain, the doll whispered, the chorus of voices quieting to a low hum. We will take what you've offered, and in return, you will be free, for now. The pressure lifted, and I stumbled back, gasping for breath as the fog rolled back, receding from my senses. The whispers faded, and I felt a strange sense of lightness wash over me, as if a great weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I blinked, stunned by the sudden clarity in my mind, but a deep sense of unease lingered. Remember, Alex, Jared said, stepping forward, this is only temporary. You've given up part of yourself, and it will come back to haunt you. You cannot escape what you have created. I nodded, fear settling back in, but I felt a newfound resolve blooming within me. I will find a way, I declared, a fire igniting in my chest. I won't let this consume me. I'll find a way to break this curse. As I turned to leave, I caught one last glimpse of the doll, its patchwork face seeming to shimmer in the dim light. The whispers still echoed in my mind, a haunting reminder of what I had offered. I stepped back into the corridor, my heart pounding, but I felt a flicker of hope. I knew I had to confront this darkness head-on, to reclaim the parts of myself I had surrendered. With every step, I resolved to uncover the truth behind the doll and the sinister forces at play, determined to escape the grasp of this twisted nightmare. As I made my way back to my apartment, the weight of the fog lingered in the air, but I refused to let it pull me down. I would find a way to reclaim what was mine. I would confront Jared, the doll, and whatever dark force had taken hold of this place. The battle wasn't over, it had only just begun. With that said, thanks for watching, and until next time.